All right. Hi there, everyone. Welcome back. As we continue ahead with our SAT prep, today primary focus is going to be on the reading section for us. Besides that, still like to kind of, begin and end with just some general questions to help everyone along with their journey. Go ahead. Let's get those started. If you have any general questions to begin class today, go ahead, put those in the chat, and I'll begin by addressing all those. Yeah. And then I had a couple of questions about this in our last meeting as well. So for right now, when the SAT, when they do their big switch over to the digital version, right now, it's just speculation as far as what the exact changes are going to be. So for as far as the SAT going digital, basically, they haven't made any official announcements. They haven't released the official new version of the test just yet. With that being said, just going based on what they have, what they've promised, that the content itself will not change. So writing skills are still going to be the same. The math skills are still going to be the same as far as algebra and geometry are concerned. When they go digital, it'll all be so. For the digital copy, content itself is not going to change at all. The format itself may change a little bit. They have said that they've brought up the idea of making it a little bit shorter with the new exam. However, with all that being said, I would not expect any of the actual question styles to change. So the question styles we've looked at with writing, question styles we'll look at today with reading, I'd expect all of that to still be in there, just maybe a slightly more condensed version for things right there. As far as when it's supposed to be coming out, and I do say supposed to just because things can change. There have been multiple things with the College Board where something is supposed to come out and then it didn't, or it got pushed back. Tentatively, we're looking at spring 2023, where they're trying to have the majority of tests become digital. As far as everything going completely digital, I wouldn't expect that to be happening at that point. I'm guessing they'll start kind of opening up some test centers accordingly, and then see how that information goes for them, get feedback, and then probably eventually get it to the point where everyone's on the same track right there. But as far as it being completely digital, we're not there yet. And so with that, there are definitely, so they're starting to roll it out in some places right now. As far as having a digital one, as far as everything that I've been told from it, even if you have a digital version of the test in this fall, it will still be the exact same structure as the current paper copy. So it'll just be the act of taking it on the computer as opposed to paper. Any test changes aren't expected until this upcoming spring with their announcement right there. But as they start rolling things out, we'll get more accurate information. Whenever they have a definitive statement, they'll be releasing it accordingly. Right. So then hopefully, that clears it up as much as we can, without the College Board making confirmations on things, we won't know for absolute certain right there. And we'll get to, all the content specific questions for reading in just a little bit. Then another thing, so addressed it last meeting as well. But there are unlimited attempts to take the SAT. So if you don't like it, definitely retake it. That is part of the game. A lot of colleges do expect you to retake it. So it's not a bad thing to do that as well. And so because of that, because it's unlimited, there's no right or wrong time necessarily to start taking it with your first one. A lot of people's, I should say the average time for when people take their first attempt is usually in the junior year, but it can even be earlier. So since you have the option to retest, not a bad thing to take it earlier. Even if you're probably going to score higher as a junior, and you're currently a sophomore, for instance, nothing wrong with taking it, getting that test day experience, learning from what you did well, learning from what you can improve on, and creating a game plan for the next attempt. For all those reasons, if you have an opportunity to test early, go for it. That's kind of in a way, many times the PSAT 10 really kind of pushes people in that door of getting in a test-taking environment, learning how to prepare for it, learning how to manage your time, dealing with the test day nerves. All that happens, and it's, we simulate it as much as possible on our own. We put in as much hard work as we can, but there is no substitute for just getting into test day and seeing how it goes for you. So nothing wrong with taking it early. As far as, the content, basically, we've kind of looked at it throughout our course accordingly. Writing, there's, all the writing that we're learning is not necessarily anything that only comes in high school. All of our writing tips and tricks are built on grammar rules that we start in middle school and below. Same thing with reading, although the reading gets more complex, more detailed. Reading is still reading, as we'll talk about today. The only thing where you might just be hesitant on it with taking it early is if you haven't actually seen the math yet. So like if you haven't gotten into algebra and geometry just yet, so thinking like, late middle school, early high school, you may not have taken algebra and geometry. That makes it tough if you haven't actually done the math material. But otherwise, for all the other sections, it can be any time where you can take the test. And to follow up on that, so many times I recommend for people, if you're preparing for the PSAT, because the PSAT 10, 11, and regular SAT are all the exact same content, it actually makes a lot of sense to take them near each other. So if you're taking the October PSAT and you take the August SAT, or you take the October SAT right around the same time, it's a really good time to take it, because your hard work is going to get paid off in two ways, with your work on the PSAT and the SAT, since the content is the same for both right there. And then there's a couple questions circling back to the math section as far as strategy goes. So the use of a calculator. This is one where there's not necessarily a right answer or wrong answer for calculator and which model to use and things like that. What I recommend for everyone is be 100% comfortable with whatever model you're using. Usually the best thing to do is just use the exact same model calculator you use at school. It's better to actually have a less fancy calculator, but you know how to work it really well, and it's going to be efficient, and there's not going to be any mistypes or anything like that. That's better to do than trying to go out and buy a calculator and you've never used it before. Even if it has more functionality, it may not work for you as well on test day. So use the calculator that you're comfortable with and can work through well accordingly for that section of the exam. Because in reality, although they allow you a calculator, the entire test can be taken without a calculator. There's nothing that absolutely requires you to have a calculator. It just helps speed you up, work faster with your calculations, have opportunities to double check your work with it. So for all those reasons, you don't need a super fancy calculator. Just use it the same way you would use it at school right there. Then for bubbling, so for how you can bubble it in, there's different strategies for it. Some people say do all your bubbles at the end, budget 3 minutes at the end to do it. I'm personally am a fan of just bubbling as you go along. The most important thing with bubbling, and this is where like kind of double checking your work comes into play. It is really easy to get a line off, like you're answering question 10, but you bubble in 11, for instance. So just be vigilant of that, making sure that you're bubbling in the right question, and then also making sure you're bubbling in the right answer. You don't want to solve it, get answer choice B, and B is correct, and then accidentally bubble in C, for instance. So just be careful on the bubbling. This is one where it is a lot of personal comfort with that. There's not like a right or wrong way to do your bubbling. I like doing it in the moment, question by question. There are definitely effective strategies of doing it all at once at the end right there. So with the digital version, you'll still have the ability to work through things on your own. And that's where like some of these things aren't fully worked out by the College Board. And it's speculation to say exactly how that will look like, but they'll definitely allow you to still show your work, even though you don't get credit for it, but just working through it on your own. So whether that's paper or if it's on a tablet, but you'll still have the ability to mark things up even when it's digital. Yeah, and then I see one other question that I haven't addressed yet. So PSAT, because I know there has been a lot of talk about PSAT, even though this is an SAT course. The PSAT is not required. It is highly beneficial. A lot of schools and school districts include it as part of their curriculum to just get you in the standardized testing window, start getting you prepared for college admissions. So because of that, many schools, like just your high school, may make it required, but it's not a national requirement. It's not a college requirement to take it. I would recommend that if your school is not offering it, try to find a neighboring school or an opportunity to take the PSAT, just for the value of getting test day experience. Because although we can prepare as much as we'd like and we can take full-length tests at home, it is a little bit different once you get in that test room and you're not in your comfort zone. So all that can be beneficial. And then to expand on that, for another reason why you take the PSAT, in your junior year, juniors are eligible for the National Merit Competition, and the entry for the National Merit Competition is the top 1% of test takers on the PSAT. So if you score in that top 1%, you're then eligible for the National Merit Competition, which has basically it turns into a full college admissions process to get that National Merit Scholarship. They have semifinalists, finalists, and ultimate winners. There is money that is associated with that National Merit Scholarship, but even more important than that is just the prestige and the honor that comes with either being a winner, semifinalist, finalist, etc. So besides just practice, there is some more tangible benefit in your junior year when you are eligible for that National Merit Competition, which only comes through the PSAT. All right. So yeah, and then that is a good question right there. For the most part, in these large group classes, I try to stay away from personal recommendations, just because I don't know all of you individually. I don't know your personal circumstances. With that being said, just go with the decision you're comfortable with as far as paper version, digital version. If you're someone who's been already preparing for the paper version, you're used to a paper version, you probably want to continue just on that path and get an opportunity to take it while it's still guaranteed to be in its current paper format. If you're on the opposite side and you haven't really done much prep yet, you really don't like paper versions, you like dealing with digital versions of things as well, you may want to wait a little bit, but also at the same time, I'm just throwing this out there as a caution, and why I always say everything about the College Board cautiously. They were supposed to release digital versions a while ago. So this has been about 2 years in the making. They were supposed to be digital about 2 years ago, and we still aren't completely. So just because they said it's coming doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. So if you'd like to wait for a digital version, by all means, you can go for that. It just may not be guaranteed that the College Board goes fully digital by the time you want or need to take it. So always, go with what's personally best for you right there. But that would just be my only caution on waiting as far as the digital version goes. All right. So great questions right there. Definitely, if you haven't asked any yet, hold on to those, and I'll leave some time at the end to recircle back to those general questions. For now, though, let's get into the reading side of things. And that's where we'll, really dig deep into the reading section today. My presentation will actually be fairly short, like in comparison to what we've seen with the math. There was so much content on the math side of things, writing as well. There was a lot of content right there. With the reading that we're going to be working on today, it is going to be more efficient as far as a presentation is concerned. My goal is to actually get into some sample passages to work through them accordingly. Hopefully that link in the group chat worked for you. If you would like to have just that copy in front of you, I'll also be putting the link in the chat for everyone. Just once we get to that moment, just in case you would prefer your own copy. For math, you're generally one problem at a time, writing one problem at a time. But with reading, when you're looking at a whole passage, sometimes it helps to have your own version instead of just the version I'll be sharing on the screen. So once again, go with what's best for you when we get to that point. One of the reasons, as we get into the SAT reading, and I'll wait just because we're still adding people into the meeting right now. Once we actually get into the article, which will be about an hour into the class, I'll put it in at that point just because by then, hopefully everyone will be in. I know we've had people joining, still in the last couple minutes. But for SAT reading, just getting first to the nuts and bolts of it. So structure and timing, we're going to see 5 passages. So that's always consistent. PSAT, SAT doesn't matter. You're always going to have 5. The only difference between SAT versus PSAT is slightly longer. These are the SAT specs on the board right now, 52 total questions, 65 minutes total. The PSAT version is just a little bit shorter than that. 5 less questions, 5 less minutes, but basically the same when you look at both exams. What that leads into is our pacing. And realistically, pacing is one of the big concerns with the reading section. Most people find that, and then once again, this is different for everyone, right? We all have our own personal strengths and weaknesses, but many times the timing is the most strategic. I'll phrase it that way. The timing is the most strategic on the reading section just because of its design, whereas math and English require a lot of outside knowledge, previous knowledge to get you started. Reading is much more based on what is in the current situation, what is provided to you in the moment. And so because of that, timing will play a role, which a lot of our presentation, a lot of our talk will get into ways to be accurate and efficient at the same time. But if we divide it evenly, that means every passage we should be taking an average of 13 minutes on. Just simple math right there, 65 divided by 5 gets us 13 minutes. You'll see as you go along with it that you will have strengths and weaknesses. So some articles will naturally take you less time. Some articles will take you more time. But on average, and especially in your training, try to have every passage be 13 minutes or less, because if you can do that consistently, you're going to have enough time on test day. And on test day, same thing with managing your time. Just have those as checkpoints as you go along. Make sure that you're spending roughly 13 minutes. If you're getting close to that mark, time to start wrapping that article up, move ahead to the next one, just so you don't run out of time. Because that's usually the worst thing that happens to people is that they get so involved with, let's say, the first 3 or first 4 articles, and they use up all their time right there. They see, oh, wait, I've got 2 minutes left and I haven't even started the final article. That's tough, right? Because then chances are you have done a lot better if just your time was dealt with evenly. We'll see as we get into it, but just as it is with the other sections, math and writing, many times it's not just like one question that trips you up, but it's more an unwillingness to leave the question. So we'll try as best we can to manage our time within that 13 minutes, which turns into either 10 or 11 questions per passage. There are some other consistencies that we're going to look at every single reading test we take. So the articles will be different each and every time, but there are a lot of things that are very, very consistent. One of those is going to be the rules and the strategies. So this goes into whatever article we're working with. The rules and strategies are always the exact same. This is a pretty simple list compared to the things we've had to deal with for math or for writing. And it's 2 things. So first, number 1 rule, always the most important rule with reading, is that all of our answers are in the text, which is different, right? In math, they don't give you every formula. They give you some, but they also don't give you a lot of others. With grammar and with writing, they don't give you the grammar rules. You have to know those previously. Reading, not the case. They will give you everything on the reading test. It's just a matter of being able to look into the article, be able to pull out that information accurately and efficiently. One of the biggest traps with that is getting into personal opinion or interpretation. Many times when people select the wrong answer on the test, they had some sort of reasoning behind it. It wasn't just like a blind guess that they got it wrong. But usually where they went wrong with their reasoning is that they started reading the article and they let their own personal bias get in the way. So maybe if it's like an argumentative piece and the author is arguing for a certain point of view, you might completely disagree with their point of view, and that's perfectly fine. But when they ask what is the answer to something, we can't base that on our personal opinion, and we have to base it on what the author said, what the author's opinion is. Even if it's not like an opinion situation, even if it's just like a matter of fact, it's sometimes easy to take logical jumps on things, of jumping too far from what the author said. Make sure we're only taking what they give us. So no more, no less, only the words that are in the text accordingly for us. That is realistically our number one thing. And this can be a little bit different than maybe what you've had to deal with at school, like in a language arts class, when you've had to read books, read stories, because there's definitely, in all classes, there's some that just has to deal with the facts. You're reading comprehension quizzes, reading, was this in the article, yes or no? But there's also a lot at school, and it's not a bad thing because it's an important skill to know, where they want to have class discussions. What's your personal opinion? How does this book make you feel? And all of that's great. It's just that when we get into the College Board test, when we get into the SAT, we have to leave that at the door, because that's not what they're testing. They're putting it in a multiple choice format, which means there can only be one right answer. And if there can only be one right answer, there can't be any personal opinion. Because if there was, that means there would be more than one right answer. We all have different opinions on things. So they're looking at facts only, just trying to get what is in the article. Did we accurately comprehend what the author is saying, is really what the section is about. There are some other consistencies that we'll be looking at. And so that deals with the types of passages that we're going to be seeing. So with our types of passages, out of the 5, one of them is going to be a piece of literature. So a traditional story, where we're dealing with characters and events and a plot, and development. So you could have like rising action, climax, falling action, all of those elements of a story, a traditional story, characters and events, what we're looking at there. The other 4 are going to be more of the nonfiction variety, thinking more of like a school textbook in a way. Out of those 4, we could divide them. So technically it's going to be 2 natural science, 1 modern social science, and 1 historical social science. Those first 3, though, so the 2 natural science and the 1 modern social science, these can be really grouped together. There are slight differences between those 2 sections. Social science is much more dealing with like the study of people, things that might be adjacent to psychology, philosophy, different disciplines like that. Whereas the natural science tends to be more our traditional science classes, whether that's physics, chemistry, different things like that is what we'd be looking at on that side of things. So either way, that's the technical breakdown. When we start getting into passage recognition, I would much more gravitate more towards, is it the literature piece? Is it the modern nonfiction? So anything where it's just very scientific presenting of information, or is it the one that's different, that one being the historical social science? We will be seeing all of these articles. We'll at least get a little bit of a view of all the different types of articles we'll see as we work through today. Our next class, I hope, in our Monday class, to kind of tie everything together, to get a little reading, a little writing, a little math, to put a bow on the course. But we'll take a look at these subtle differences, especially with strategic differences, for how to handle the different types of passages. One thing to note for the historical social science is that one will always be argumentative. So we're looking at some sort of article that was written, and the author is describing something that's happening for them currently in their society. Now, for them, current was 1700 or 1800, whatever it may be, but describing something that's happening in their society, and they are also presenting their viewpoint on if that's a good thing, a bad thing. So that one is guaranteed to be argumentative, whereas the other 3, the modern ones, the natural science, the social science, they can also be argumentative, but it's more in the context of science, of I have reached this conclusion via the research, whereas the historical one, it's just, this is my opinion because it's my opinion. So being able to see that when we recognize historical, no, it always will be argumentative. Some other general notes that we're going to have is that 2 of the 3 modern nonfictions will contain graphs or charts. So we saw that in the writing side a little bit, where we want to make sure that whatever is in our writing is always in agreement with any graph or chart present. The same idea of being consistent with what the author is saying is even applicable to charts and graphs. We'll also see it on the reading as well. And so whatever is in the chart or graph is true. They may ask us to interpret it just the same way we would be asked to interpret text. We'll get to it with some of the strategy and how I like to handle those graphs and charts. At the end of the day, it's still reading. It's just a slightly different form of reading, looking for something, slightly different right there. Additionally, one of the nonfictions, so one of the 4, and this can either be the modern or the historical, but one of those is going to be comparative, which means we're going to have 2 half-length articles. They're each going to be on the same topic, so related to each other in some way, but each providing a unique perspective on it. When we get to, and we'll see an example one as well of those, but when we get to that, we'll see that they can sometimes be, for the most part, in agreement with each other and just bringing a slightly different viewpoint to what they're talking about. Other times it can be a situation where they are polar opposites. There's nothing they agree on. They're going at each other. So that's going to be one of the big things when we get there, is not just understanding what the topic is, but what is each one's unique perspective going to be. Knowing the article you're getting into before you even start can be helpful, because it will help your strategy. The way you might read a historical one is a little bit different in what you're looking for than just a pure scientific analysis of an experiment versus a story. So understanding that can be helpful for slight differences in strategy for your read. Now, other things to look at, things that are going to be consistent no matter what passage you're looking at, are going to be the types of questions that we're viewing. And so, breaking it down to its simplest form, there's 3 major types of questions that we're going to be seeing. One of them is going to be big picture / summary. So talking about the entirety of the article, what was it about? It could be what were the major events in the story. It could be what is the primary claim, such as what is the thesis statement. In a nonfiction one, what is an opinion that the author is presenting, but something that encapsulates the whole article. With the big picture summary, this is the one that's going to be most affected by your reading technique. And we'll talk about that more as we go on. There are different ways to read the articles. There's not necessarily a good or better way to read the articles. It is very, very personal. All of us read and process information in different ways. So finding the way that works best for you, or even having a couple different techniques, and depending on the article type, you may choose one or the other, is very, very helpful. Depending on which initial reading technique you choose, as far as reading it in full first versus skipping straight to the questions, will affect how you handle those questions if you do them first or last. The second one is going to be vocabulary in context. We dealt with this a little bit on the writing already. The key with vocabulary in context is the in context part, making sure it's not about memorizing the dictionary. Although the bigger your vocabulary is, the better. It's not a bad thing to know the meaning of words, but they're going to be taking words that carry multiple definitions that can mean multiple things. That 90% of the time, if you look at all the answer choices, all of them are valid dictionary definitions. Occasionally, they'll give you an obscure word where there is just the one answer. But even then, you're able to figure it out with context clues. So we'll really dig into that as far as being able to read around the word to take what the author gives us to establish meaning. The third main category for types of questions is going to be evidence-based details. We'll see a major one that'll come up is the paired questions, and we'll be doing plenty of practice of that as far as working the pairs together. But the key with all detailed questions is that it goes back to the idea on the previous board that all answers come from the text. Our goal is to gather evidence, to look back into the text and say, I'm picking answer choice B, not just because that's what I feel like or that's my own opinion. I'm picking answer choice B because the text said it. And the more specific you can be about that by saying line 32 says the exact same thing as answer choice B, the better off we're going to be, especially the more detailed the question is going to be. If it's a big picture, it may not be that case. You may kind of be looking at more an accumulation of the whole text, but on detailed questions, you'll always be able to prove it by something from the text itself. So we'll talk about that and show how that can be very, very effective. Now, getting into the first question, so the big picture or summary. As I mentioned, there's a couple different ways to read the articles, but if you have some sort of read before you get into it, because we'll talk about an alternative of one where you just go straight to the questions and not even read the article. But if you're reading the article beforehand, or at least skimming it beforehand, big picture is all about reading it efficiently, knowing what I should look for so that I'm not trying to memorize the whole article, but just getting the most important, the most relevant information. So what is big picture? I split this two ways. The first one is for the story, the one piece of literature you're going to see per test. And what are stories about? And a great exercise for this to think about is think to yourself, well, what is my favorite story? Could be TV show, movie, book, anything with a storyline, or even just the most recent one. What was the last TV show I watched? If you're going to tell a friend about what happens, you wouldn't, word for word recite the book or word for word recite the script. You wouldn't focus on the smallest details of the movie. You would focus on the big things. And the big things are always the characters. So who was in the story, in the major events? What did they do? You may have heard of the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. All of those are the things that tell a story. When we're talking about big picture on the test, the two most important W's are going to be the who and the what. If we can accurately understand what those are going to be, we're going to be in very, very good position. Now, on the other side, the other 4, the nonfiction ones, and I put in parentheses essay for them, because the same way you have to write like research papers at school is the same way these are going to be written. There's some pros and cons to both types of writing. With a story, you get a lot of intrigue, right? You get characters, you get involved in their character development, the storyline. Nonfiction, you're not going to have that. There's not going to be characters. There's not going to be a storyline. Even if there are people, it just tends to be, okay, this is this researcher and he did this experiment that we're building on, or this was my research partner and we worked together on something, but not true characters or character development. So that can be a con, especially if you're not interested in the material itself. That definitely can cause a little bit of difficulty in the reading, whether it's just the material itself you find confusing, how they're writing it makes it difficult to understand. Maybe you're not familiar with the topic at all, or it could just be, where you're not interested at all in the article, right? All those things can sometimes make nonfiction a little bit harder. Now, at the same time, there are some big time advantages, though, to nonfiction style writing compared to stories. And that gets into the structure and how they're written. And we'll be going through at least one example later today that showcases that structure very, very well. And that is the structure of an essay. So when you have to write an essay at school, we have traditional 5-paragraph format. The first paragraph is going to be the introduction. From the introduction, you should be able to firmly establish what is the topic of the article, and if there's any opinion associated with the article. Those generally develop early, unless it's like an experiment and they're bringing a bunch of research together where they just say, hey, I'm going to investigate this. At the end, I'll give you my conclusion. But if it's like a historical one where they're going to let you know their opinion fairly early, that should come fairly soon. The other thing about introductory paragraphs is traditionally, especially when we write them, it's more of a 1-paragraph format for that. We'll also see where sometimes they do a 2-paragraph introduction, and they tend to be shorter length when that's the case. But where paragraph 1 is background information, paragraph 2 is the actual claim. So what is the topic? And if there's an opinion with a thesis statement. But early on, we should at least know generally what it's about. Then, as you start working through it, the details will begin to work themselves out more and more with each body paragraph. Typically, each body paragraph will have one main idea that it focuses on. This is where, like when you go through a writing process at school and you have to outline your essay, you start talking about topic sentences. So if you start going through your bodies and you can formally identify a topic sentence, that's great. That's going to decrease the amount that you have to read because the topic sentence will prompt you to what that main idea is for the paragraph. Now, in contrast, sometimes you may not formally identify a topic sentence. That's fine. Hopefully by the first few sentences, you kind of see where it's going and you can tend to skim the rest of it. But even if you end up reading the whole paragraph, just having that opportunity to reflect and say, okay, before I go ahead to the next paragraph, just what did I read? What was the one main idea of it? And marking that down, marking up the articles is great, especially with the paper test. When you can underline things, it makes it a lot easier to go back for it. But marking it down, underlining what the main idea was, that can be extremely, extremely helpful. Going along with that idea of marking things up, because there's a common question that gets asked as far as what's the best way to kind of take notes, to actively read as I go through the article. This is a very, very individual question. It's not the same answer for everyone in here. Some people like to actually make their own notes, put the article into their own words as they go along. That's great. A lot of the times that leads to the greatest comprehension when you take those active notes. The only issue tends to be just the timing aspect of it. If you're rewriting things, that can be time consuming. So just be cautious of that if you normally do that technique at school. Some people are the exact opposite. They're like, hey, I don't want to mark anything up. I just want to read. I just want to be focused on the reading. That is great. Just make sure you keep track of things in your own head. A lot of times the happy middle ground for things is getting into more of an underlining side of just underlining key ideas, whether that's character names or events, whether that's topic sentences, thesis. Really quick, doesn't take much time at all to underline, but then it gives you something to look back to when you have to go to your questions. It tells you what were the big ideas, where were ideas generally located. So underlining, starring things, that can be a very, very effective middle ground for marking things up. And then if we have a nonfiction, it'll all come together at the conclusion. This can vary from article to article. Sometimes the conclusion is just a summary, a restatement of what we've seen. And many times if we see that that's the case, we'll just skim through the conclusions. Say, okay, yeah, that all makes sense. That all looks familiar. Other times, especially if it was an experiment, they may be building to a conclusion of their experiment. These are the results that we built to. This is now our statement or our opinion of things. It could be a call to action. Now that we've done this, this is the next stage. Different things that can happen there. But even then with the conclusion, typically one main idea that you're going to grab from that last paragraph. And I know all of these I'm just kind of speaking generally about. With reading, I really like to dive into just those full articles as quickly as we can, but just giving this general background for things to get us started. Other things, just kind of going back to our three main types of questions that we're going to be looking at, tips for vocabulary and context, and we'll be seeing plenty of these very, very shortly. We'll break down specific examples of it. One of the best things to do, though, is to read the sentence. And when you do that, don't even worry about the word itself. Just read the sentence, gather as much context as you can. From there, then you're determining what word makes the most sense. If all the words seem a little bit unusual, none of them really fit the situation, sometimes it can actually be better to put your own word in there, pretend you were the author, how would I write it? Then you can play a matching game, which word matches most with what you would put in there. No matter what, the important thing, though, is that second step right there. Make sure we are gathering context. Don't rely on just trying to guess a dictionary definition. Don't rely on just, I've used this word this way before. All of that are common traps. Make sure it's the exact context that will determine our exact answer. As far as the evidence-based details go, I mentioned for all detailed questions, we're trying to get exact evidence from the article to prove something is correct. One thing that we will see is going to be evidence-based pairs. These are very, very common on the exam. On average, we're going to see 2 pairs per article. So put that all together, 2 times 5 is 10. Each pair has 2 questions. So on average, about 20 of our 52 questions are going to be this paired variety. So we'll get some exact practice on it, but knowing how to deal with them is really important. They are kind of a hallmark of the SAT. You don't always see them on other standardized tests. But it's 2 questions. First one is a detail. Second one will ask you evidence to support your original claim. Many times the best way to address them is to work backwards. And that's exactly what we'll do in a couple minutes when we get into a sample article. But working backwards just means you understand what the question's asking. So what is the objective? What's the goal? And then from there, you go straight to your evidences. They'll give you 4 lines that could be contenders. Go through each of them, see, are they even relevant? Are they addressing the original prompt, the original issue? And if they do, can I then pair it with an answer choice? The goal is to have those 2 fit perfectly together like puzzle pieces, where one perfectly matches the other. They address the original prompt. That'll know that you have a right answer. And actually, you'll have 2 right answers because they work together like that. So we'll definitely be getting into some of these, but just a little bit of a preview of what that technique is going to look like. Now, as far as reading techniques go, because I know I've even had some questions pop up during this presentation of ways to read the article. Like I said, this is very, very personal. This is not a one-size-fits-all situation right here. We've got option 1, which is just a full read. So reading it basically word for word. For some people, that works great. Generally, this is most effective to do a full read. If you tend to be a little bit of a faster reader, if you're at least an average speed reader or above average in your reading speed, there's enough time to do that full read. But secondly, the full read tends to be more effective when you get into it and you're seeing, this seems to be a fairly easy article. I'm picking it up fairly well. Generally, that's when the full read tends to be most effective because you're able to pick up a lot of information that way. It's all coming very, very easily to you, and you're not taking a ton of time to do so. There's a second technique that's a little bit similar to this. You're still reading it, but you're able to cast some stuff aside as you go along. That second one being the general skim. And with a general skim, this is where knowing what type of article you're working with is very, very important because you want to search for those big picture items on a general skim. So for that skim, going back a little bit, for a story, make sure you know who your main characters are in your major events. Anytime they introduce a character by name, make sure you have that conscious effort to understand who is this character. That's a super high priority. Or if you see a major event happening, a major plot line, take note of that. But when you're skimming, you kind of skip over all the little details, right? You don't have to know every line of dialogue. You don't have to know everything about the setting. But make sure you know those first 2 things, the main characters, the major events. Even if you're doing a full read, you still want to know those, but especially when you're skimming, make sure that's the case. A general skim for a nonfiction basically means you're following the outline. Generally means you read a little bit more in the introduction because all that is going to be a bunch of new information presented to you. Make sure as you go paragraph by paragraph, you get one main idea for each. Sometimes this can even mean just obtaining a topic sense and moving on, not even worrying about the rest of the paragraph. And then a conclusion generally wraps things up. You may start to skim that ahead. Again, make sure nothing in there is catching you by surprise. The key, though, with the general skim is that as you're going through something, and if there's a little detail that makes sense, that doesn't make sense, I should say, just cast it aside. Don't worry about one little detail. That's not going to make a difference for your overall big picture. If that detail becomes important later on, they'll tell you to go back and investigate it. The biggest thing is just don't reread things just to reread it. If you don't get it the first time, that's okay. Dig into the questions, but at least you have some knowledge. Some knowledge is better than none getting into the questions. For each of those first 2 strategies, either a full read or a general skim, and this is a loose recommendation, right? So some will be shorter. Some, if you go 5 minutes, it's not the end of the world. But For the first two strategies, if you're going more of a full read or a general skim, I recommend taking 4 minutes or less to read through it, because if you do that, that leaves you at least 9 minutes to get through the questions, close to a minute per question on average. If you do that, you'll have enough time to work through it. The more time you have for the questions, the better. And this is just where the balancing act comes into play, because some people would say, well, if I want the most amount of time for the questions I can possibly get, what if I just go straight to the questions? What if I don't even read the article to begin with? That can work, right? That is a very effective tool. It can be effective. The one thing I would just caution on with that technique is generally people that go straight to the questions, they tend to have a little bit lower accuracy on big picture ones, because many times the wrong answers on big picture questions will be things that did happen in the article, but they're just a really small detail. They only happened once. They only got brought up once. We may be more inclined to answer some of those trap questions when going straight to the question. So be aware of that. Generally, a lot of people tend to gravitate more towards technique 2, a general skim, where you read it, but you're not concerned about every single word. That way, you at least have general knowledge to fall back on, but you're also not taking a ton of time. You're giving as much time as possible to get to the questions themselves. So general skim for a lot of people tends to be the best. But you can go to either side if it works for you. If you would rather take a little bit longer, 5 minutes, and you do a full read, but then you are locked in, you know exactly what happened, great, because the questions aren't going to take as long if you processed everything. Or vice versa, you're like, hey, I really don't want to read it. I just want to go straight to the questions, bounce around. That's also great as well. There is no wrong way to read articles. They're just finding which way works best for you. Another thing that's just kind of more of just like a general rule of thumb. Once again, play around with the techniques. The best thing to actually do is read 3 different articles and try each one and see how you do with your accuracy and your time with each one, finding out what's best for you. But just one general thing that tends to happen is most people tend to see that the literature pieces, the stories, those tend to be harder to go straight to the questions on, because so much of it is based on characters and plot development, where it's hard to just kind of go to like a single plot point without knowing the whole plot line. It tends to be a little bit harder to go straight to the questions on that, but not impossible. Whereas with the nonfiction ones, it usually tends to be a little bit easier to either do a really short skim or going straight to the questions, just because of that essay structure. Like I said, I've seen people do all techniques for all passages. I've seen people have success with all techniques and all sorts of passages, but those are just some general recommendations, some general things I've seen in the past right there. One good question, and we'll see this as we work through some sample articles, is that as a whole, on average, the questions tend to move in order. Now, it's not perfect. It's not a guarantee that each question will move sequentially. But generally speaking, the first couple of questions will tend to either be big picture or dealing with things early in the passage, whereas we get deeper along and they tend to focus more on things later in the passage. As just a general rule, if you're looking at something and you're not really sure where to look at all for it, you can definitely utilize that advantage for it, as far as, okay, this is one of the first questions, I'm probably going to zero in on the beginning, versus, okay, this is one of the final questions, I'm probably going to focus on the end. But it's not a perfect system right there. They definitely can mix it up at times. So it's not a complete guarantee as far as the ordering of questions are concerned right there. My personal recommendation, I think the most people do tend to have most success with the general skim, but I've seen people go perfect going with the full read as long as they manage their time effectively. I've seen people go perfect going straight to the questions as long as they save the big picture ones for last. That is one thing to note. If you do go straight to the questions, save your big picture ones for last. let the general accumulation of knowledge going through the questions help you before answering big picture ones. So I've seen all of them work. Definitely encourage all of you to try multiple techniques out. Everyone processes it different. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you'll find out, okay, this is what works for me. This is what I'm comfortable with. And then you can ultimately play to your strengths on test day. One other thing to note before we get into a sample passage, and this will help answer some like the very specific questions I'm seeing in the chat by seeing questions in front of us, seeing how the test operates and how they ask us things. One thing to note is that most people tend to have strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the article types. Some people pretty much perform the same on every single one. That's great. But a lot of times people will see that either the story is one of the easiest ones for them or one of the hardest ones for them. And you could play that for any of them, the science, the historical, whatever it may be. So if you notice that the historical one is always the hardest one for you, save that one for last. Just like how on math, you want to do the questions in order of difficulty, start easy, work harder. Same thing on reading. If you know there's an article that gives you more trouble, save that to last. You recognize that one's coming up, skip it completely, do the other articles first, come back to it. This works twofold. If it means that on the other 4 articles, you took a little bit more time, and in that time, you got all the questions right that you could, well, that's great because you added up a lot of questions. And if that means I have to run out of time and guess, well, if I have to guess, I'm going to want to do it on the hardest article, the one that I was probably going to get the least amount right anyway. Vice versa. Let's say you go through the other 4 articles. They all work very, very efficiently for you. And now you've built up some more time. You get to your last article and now you have 20 minutes left instead of 13. That gives you the luxury of processing it a little bit more slower, giving you more time to work through the article that was going to give you the most trouble, but something that you wouldn't want to do initially because you don't want to run out of time on an easier passage, right? Because that's just giving right answers away. So for that reason, if you recognize it in your prep that there is one article type that's more challenging for you, that's perfectly fine. That's to be expected. Use that strategically. Save that one for last. Vice versa, if you know there is always one that's always the easiest one for you, feel free to pick out that article first. So that can be very, very effective as well. So let's put this stuff into action. And definitely keep on asking those general questions, right? Those are all good. I know there's some I haven't answered yet, but that's because those are coming. Those are coming with the sample article and seeing some of these questions in action. So let me switch things up, and this is where I'll give the link to everyone at this time. So for the link, if you're on your phone or something and you can't necessarily follow along on the link, no worries. I'm going to be sharing this on my screen anyway. I just know some people prefer to have the link in front of them so they can scroll around it. They can zoom in on different things as you go along. So this is just for your preference. If you would prefer to have that copy instead of what I'm sharing, go for it. But this is just making it easier for you, whichever version works for you, having your own version to scroll around on or having the version I'm sharing, all for your benefit right here. And so what I'm sharing is this exact link. This is one of the official practice tests from the College Board. There are 8 of the official practice tests actively on the College Board website. There are a couple other official practice tests that were released by the College Board that are just not actively on the website. Those are test 2 and test 4. They are still official. So if you find test 2 or test 4 online, know that they are a good thing to practice off as well. They had just taken those down, right? And so you put that up, right now on the College Board website, they've got 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. There are the 10 official ones. If you look at Khan Academy, the official practice tests on there are identical to the PDFs that you will see from the College Board website. then it just gets into pros and cons of the two ways to do it. The PDF gives you greater control. It allows you to break it up, over more than one sitting. It doesn't force you to time yourself. The advantages of Khan Academy is that they have you take it in the test environment. They put a clock on you. They grade it for you. So it's just, personal preference, of getting that work in the venue that you want to see. But what we have right here, this is just an example of just, the PDF version, what you're going to look at. One thing for the reading section, if you go with the PDF versions, if you have the ability to print them off for the reading section, that does tend to be easier. If you have a paper copy, just so you can see everything in front of you, you don't have to scroll back and forth. But if you are going digitally, I do recommend it more like how I have it set up right now. Either if you have a PDF viewer viewing 2 pages at once, or just lining up 2 web windows right next to each other, that does make it a little bit easier to be able to see everything at once when you're doing your personal practice. So this is the beginning of it right here. So just, reading test, we have the 65 minutes, 52 questions detailed in the instructions right there. And this right here is the first question, our first article. Questions 1 through 10 are based on the following passage. We see that question 1 starts things off on the right-hand side. No matter what, before you start an article, I highly, highly recommend looking at the copyright information. It seems like something that's like, oh, well, why would I look at that? They're not going to ask me where it was copyrighted or when it was written. And that's true, right? There aren't going to be any direct questions on the copyright information. However, we can generally recognize what type of article it's going to be, whether that's story versus modern scientific textbook style writing versus a historical argumentative one. We can almost always see that from this brief introduction. And if there's any necessary background information, that will be provided there for us, because with reading, everything has to come from the article accordingly. But they may give you some background info. If it's given to you there, it is considered fair game. Otherwise, we don't have to know anything else. That's a good question as far as the certain order of the passage. So with the SAT, that's not necessarily the case. Generally, the literature piece generally comes first. It doesn't always come first, but that is a general pattern you'll see. As far as the other 4 are concerned, I've seen them in all sorts of orders, especially like the historical one, because typically that stands out compared to the others. I've seen that come 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, for instance. That is in difference to the ACT. So if you've done any ACT prep, ACT always puts their 4 articles in the exact same order. SAT doesn't always do that. So are there some patterns? Yes, like with the story generally coming early on, for sure, but it's not a guarantee. So for that reason, and also just to kind of set your expectations, take a look at that copyright information. In this case, this passage is from Lydia Minatoya, Strangest of Beauty. So far could be anything, 1999, Lydia Minatoya. So far still could be anything. But then they follow it up. The setting is Japan in 1920. She and her daughter Naomi are members of the House of Fuji, a noble family. So 1, we got some information. Okay, this is in Japan, and we know 2 people, Chi and Naomi, are brought to us in this introduction without having to decipher it on our own. They just told us that piece of information. Secondly, this also tells us what type of article we're dealing with. Because we have character names and we're dealing with a setting, this is guaranteeing for us that this is going to be some sort of story. So as a result, if we start reading it, whether that's a full read, whether that's a general skim, that means that's what we're looking for. Who are our characters? What did they do? They gave us a little clue right here, but ultimately that's what we're trying to work on and trying to understand. If you kind of, are a person where you're like, okay, I'm going to skip ahead to the questions, I'd rather deal with those first instead of read, That's fine, right? You'll probably notice that the first two are going to be big picture in nature. Which choice best describes what happens in the passage? Which choice best describes the developmental pattern of the passage? Both of those very much big picture. So if you went straight to the questions, I would skip those first. I would go straight to 3 and below, do the detailed ones first. You'll come back to accumulate general knowledge accordingly. Vice versa, if we're going through a skim, a general read first, well, those are going to work perfect for us because then those are just having us reflect on what we just read. If we were to summarize it ourselves, what would we say and match it up to an answer accordingly? For this first article, I'm going to have us go over that technique of more of a general full read or at least a general skim and just have everyone work through it at their own pace right here. So let's take about 4 or 5 minutes right here. And I'd just like everyone to read through the article on your own. And if you want to start looking ahead to some of the questions, that's great. But what we'll do is take this general reading. We'll come back. Okay, what was this about? Help us match that up to the first two. And then we'll get into some of the more detailed questions from there, working through the techniques accordingly. So just to get us started, take some time, about 4 or 5 minutes roughly, read through the article on your own, and then we'll come back and decipher what it was about. All right, so let's go ahead, start talking through what we saw right here. So we recognize this was a story, and with a story, the highest priorities for big picture get down to our characters and events. So, who were the characters in this story? What do we know about them? What did our characters do? So we've got three of them, right? We have two that we were introduced to at the beginning. We've got she and her daughter Naomi. So those two, they're from the same family. And then we've also got a third character. We've got Akira that gets introduced in the first line of the story right there. Now, as we go through the rest of it, it's just involving those three. There are a couple other like people mentioned, like the maid, for instance. But the only people that get mentioned by name, the only major characters, are going to be those three. And as we start working through the article, well, what does this story center around, right? There's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of little details that happen. Ultimately, the biggest thing is Akira's trying to marry Naomi. He's seeking Chi's permission to be able to marry Naomi. And everything is surrounding that. So even like the details of how that happens, some of the extenuating circumstances that are surrounding the proposal and all these events, all of it centers around the proposal itself. And so when we're talking big picture of a story, that's exactly it. If we know the major events, we know who our people are, we get those straight, everything else going to fall into place. So then we can use that on the first two questions because they are big picture for us. Question one, which choice best describes what happens in the passage? Well, we know it's centered around this marriage proposal. Which one of our answers is best going to showcase that? We'll go ahead and start, putting those answers in as we work through it and as we talk through this answer. And excellent. Seen a lot of right ones come in. That being choice B. So one character receives a surprising request from another character. She was not expecting that Akira was going to be proposing, therefore it is surprising. And everything centers around the request right there. One other thing that we can talk about in terms of the reading section is that not only will we be able to say that something is right, there will always be proof of why the other three answers are wrong. And this is by design. The College Board designs it that way. So not just that you can prove the right one, but also why the others are wrong. Sometimes when you're not sure what the best one is, that can be the first thing to do. Work through all of them and try to find flaws to pick at. So like with A, one character argues with another character who intrudes on her home. Right off the bat, we can eliminate that because there is no intrusion. Akira does ask for permission to enter, is granted permission to enter. So even if you're saying, wait, there's a little bit of an argument because they're not on the same page, there is no intrusion. So we can safely eliminate that. With C, one character reminisces about choices she has made over the years. So this one, there's a little bit of partially tempting aspect to it because in the first four lines, we definitely have a little bit of a flashback to set the stage of what's to come. So there is a little bit of looking back and about the choices that were made, but it's the choices that were made by Akira. And we see he's identified as a male. So the pronoun right here is off, and even just that little bit throws that one off for sure. Even though there was a flashback, there is that part that tells us that that's not going to be it. D, one character criticizes another character for pursuing an unexpected course of action. So this one's probably the trickiest of the false ones right here because there is a little bit of criticism at the end. She starts talking to Naomi about how could he do such a thing? How could he think this would work? But even with that criticism, it's not directed towards Akira. She doesn't directly criticize Akira. And even if we said, okay, well, there's still criticism of Akira right there, that's still more a smaller thing just happening at the very, very end as opposed to the grand scheme of the article right there. So that does lock in, that does confirm that B is going to be our best answer. Similarly, we're going to see on 2, which choice best describes the developmental pattern of the passage. Developmental means that it's having to deal with the entire article, coming through the whole thing, building up on each other right there. So we want something that encapsulates everything. And we'll kind of look at this the same way, of thinking, okay, what's going to be the best answer here, and breaking down our choices. So if we look at the first one, it definitely starts off tempting with choice A, a careful analysis of a traditional practice, because they do bring up that there was some sort of tradition that was supposed to be involved, and they do say that that was broken. However, it's not a nonfiction article where they're just analyzing these are marriage traditions around the world, proposal traditions around the world. This is dealing with the specific people, the specific characters we have. And so, although that's true, you might not eliminate that right away. It's not the primary thing for us. Analysis in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean it has to be nonfiction. Even if it was characters, we could be analyzing what other people thought, but that's just a small piece of this right here. It's much more the proposal itself that we're looking at. So we'll hold on to it. I might not eliminate it right away, but I'd be cautious of that one. B, a detailed depiction of a meaningful encounter. This one checks out. Automatically, this is going to be better than A, because detailed depiction, well, we've got 95 lines of detail of a meaningful encounter. A marriage proposal would be a meaningful encounter. So that one checks out. So far, B is the strongest answer. C, a definitive response to a series of questions. This one can be tricky as well, because we don't really truly get a definitive response. Although at the very end, Naomi says that she does intend to marry Akira, we don't know what she responds to that with, if she gives the blessing or not. So that may be a little bit up in the air right there. Also, the other part of series of questions is kind of interesting, because realistically, there's just one question right here of just, is she going to grant permission for them to get married? So the series, that also throws it off. So C would be out as well. Then with D, cheerful recounting of an amusing anecdote. This one is written in a much more serious nature. It's a serious circumstance of them getting married or not. So that would be thrown out, and that confirms B is going to be our best one. One thing, and this is just kind of a note to look at, I brought it up with writing as well. Make sure you look at all 4 answers. Sometimes you'll look at one and see, oh yeah, that's really good. I like that. And then you're like, wait, now there's something better. Or now these 2 both seem similar. Make sure you look at all 4 first. Don't automatically assume the first good one you see is the best one. Now, getting into some further strategy with things. This gets us into 3, 4, and 5. These are all going to be heavy strategy questions. So I mentioned vocab and context was a really big part of these reading articles. That's exactly what we're looking at in question 3. As used in line 1 and line 65, directly most nearly means blank. Notice they're not asking what's the dictionary definition of the word directly, because if they ask that, any of the 4 could be the answer. All 4 of these could be a dictionary definition of the word we're looking at. So instead, what's our strategy? We want to read through it. We don't even want to really worry about the word itself. We'll read around it. If we need more than one sentence, we'll read a little bit before or a little after to help us out as well. So we start off with line 1. Akira came blank, breaking whole tradition. So just in that, we know that in this context directly has something to do with breaking tradition. We see 65 as well. It says, I asked blank because the use of a go-between takes much time. Now, with that in mind, this kind of links together, because right after sentence 1, they had described the tradition as involving this go-between. Had he asked his mother to speak to his father to approach a go-between. So we know, however he's asking, it's breaking tradition. It's not using a go-between. And they do also say that the reasoning is because the go-between takes too much time. So as we analyze our situation it has to involve those ideas right there. And as we get into our choices, this will help set apart the one right answer from the other ones that are traps, that are very, very reasonable. You can make an argument for them, but ultimately they're a personal opinion. There's only one that stands out as the meaning from the article. So let's take a look at what we've got. So the first one, frankly. To be frank means to get to the point. You could say he's doing that, right? If he shows up and he just says, hey, I'd like to marry your daughter, and the mother doesn't really know about this previously, you could say that's frank. You might also say he's not frank because he really doesn't get around to actually saying why he's here until about line 50, right? At line 45, she says, well, this is great that you're going to America, that you might be a dentist, but how does that concern me? She has no idea. It takes him 50 lines to get to the point. That can be argued both ways. Frank is not the answer. Same thing with confidently. You could argue he's being confident. That would require confidence to seek permission. There would be confidence to break tradition. You could also argue he's not confident because he appears nervous, and there's wording that shows he's nervous. So that as well is a matter of opinion, whether that's true or not. C, without mediation. This one is actually going to be our best answer because mediation, you may have heard the term like to mediate or to go to mediation, is the act of getting everyone together and formulating a solution for things. So that works out because he did not involve the other people. He did not have his mother speak to his father to approach a previous go-between. So if we have textual evidence that C is true. Now we'll also look at D just to make sure with precision. This kind of gets into the idea of frankly, if he's being very precise with his wording and his actions, that could be argued either way. But we have definitive proof that C must be the answer because of that statement that he did not involve tradition, this go between everyone meeting about it beforehand. He just showed up by himself and asked by himself right there. So get that proof whenever we're looking at questions, especially with our vocab. Utilize those context clues because dictionary-wise, directly could mean any of those right there. All right. And as we go on, kind of pause right there. Any questions as far as like that technique is concerned of getting that context first, using that to pick your answer as opposed to just relying on the meaning of the word first? And don't be afraid to ask anything right there. I do see some other questions that are a little bit more like general, so I'll save those till the end, but just if there's any concerns about that technique. All right. So then we'll go ahead with things. And so for this next one, I'll kind of zoom out a little bit. So I know it may kind of get small on your end as far as what we're looking at right here. Definitely feel free to just, minimize what we're looking at here and utilize the linked version if that ends up being the case for you. But the reason why I'm expanding this out is because this is actually going to be an example of one of those two-part questions, one of those paired questions. So I want to scan ahead so that we can get both of those in our screen accordingly. This is something on test day, definitely be on the lookout for them. On average, you're going to get two of these pairs per article. So how do we recognize a pair? Well, the first one is a detail. In this case, which reaction does it cure most fear from chi? The second one is always phrased the exact same way. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? There are some kind of cousins of this question that ask for like certain evidence or things like that. But when we're talking about a pair, it's always phrased exactly like this. Once you recognize a pair, the most important thing is that these have to work together. One has to be the proof for the other and vice versa. Ultimately, our goal is to just put in the work for both of these at the same time and get two right answers for the price and effort of one. And so how do we do that? There's no right or wrong answer, because ultimately at the end of the day, if you get the right answer, that was the right way of doing things. But what I recommend is look at the first one. There's a chance that you might be 100% convinced of the right answer because it was just a detail you remembered. It was something that really stood out to you. If so, that's great. Look at it, go to your evidences, find out which evidence proves that answer. But if there's any doubt in your mind, or if you're just not sure to start off with, don't worry about trying to figure it out on your own. Don't worry about rereading the entire article. Instead, go straight to the evidences because they are telling you your answer to the question is going to be within one of those 4 lines. Guaranteed. You don't have to read elsewhere. And so as we go through them, ask ourselves 2 questions. 1, does it address the original issue? And then 2, can I create a pair from it? Sometimes we'll see situations where there's only one relevant evidence. All the others aren't on topic with the original question. Other times, we'll see situations where there's a couple evidences that work towards our original point of view. There may even be 2 evidences that are pointing to the same first answer. Then we just have to see which one's more complete. Ultimately, though, there is only going to be one perfect pair when we look at everything. So in order to do that, first thing is the priority. What is the question asking? Which reaction does Akira most fear from Chi? With how the question's being asked, we have to know and understand what is Akira concerned about right here. It's not what Naomi thinks. It's not what Chi thinks. It's what Akira thinks. So we have to know what is his concern. So we can go through those. First one, 33, says his voice was soft, refined. Right, so that one definitely shows that he's concerned, right? If his voice is soft, refined, maybe he's a little bit nervous, but we don't know why he's nervous, right? What is he fearing? We don't get it from that evidence. I would cross that one out and move to the next one. 4951. You know how children speak so earnestly, so hurriedly, so endearingly about things that have no importance in an adult's mind. Right, so that's definitely could be a concern. This one kind of is a little bit of a trap because childlike and immaturity really pair together. So like on 4 with earnestness for immaturity, that could go with childlike. Only problem is that this isn't necessarily what Akira fears. In fact, it clarifies on the line after, that's how she viewed him as a child. So this is what she thinks. It's not necessarily what Akira thinks or what Akira is concerned about. This may still prove to be the right answer, but this evidence isn't going to tell us that right there. So 4951 is out as well. Then we look at our next one, 6364. So this one gives us a quote. We have an understanding. Please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. You can expand it a little bit to confirm, yes, this quote is coming from Akira. This is something that he is concerned about. So this could definitely be a contender right here. This definitely might be our best answer accordingly. But look at all 4 of them, right? Want to make sure that there's not, a good versus better or anything like that, because that will pop up. So let's look at the last one, 7172. That one says, eager to make his point, he'd been looking her full in the face. Kind of similar to A right there, of it showing that he is concerned, but we don't know what about. As a result, we can safely eliminate this one as well. This is one of those examples where there is only one relevant evidence. They won't always be like that. Sometimes there is more than one evidence is relevant. Those ones can sometimes be a little bit trickier. But in this case, we can lock in 5 first. We know for sure it's 6364. Now, once we do that, then we're going to 4. And then we're saying, well, I'm just utilizing 63, 64 to prove my answer. Which one of my answers on 4 says exactly that? Please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. Once we have that, now we'll have completed a pair accordingly, and we'll have 2 right answers for the effort of 1. So we go through them. A, she will consider his proposal inappropriate. This seems to be pretty spot on right here because his concern was about the proposal. The unseemliness of this proposal is specifically his concern. So it's talking about the proposal. To be unseemly means to be inappropriate. So if you know that word's meaning, you know those 2 line up. You can probably feel pretty good penciling in this answer right now. If you don't know the word unseemly, you might know that he is breaking tradition and that could be considered inappropriate. Or you might just hold on to it for now, see what the others have to offer. We go to B. So she will mistake his earnestness for immaturity. Doesn't mention anything about immaturity or anything that would mean the same thing in 63, 64. So that doesn't work. It doesn't talk about it being an imposition right here. It just is about how he's asking. So it's not C. And it doesn't talk about the sincerity of his emotions either. So this would confirm that A on 4, C on 5 must be the 2 right answers accordingly. Generally you are just looking at that 1 line right there. Sometimes it helps to expand it, right? You might take the full quote right here. We have an understanding. Please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. I ask directly because the use of a go-between takes much time. Either method comes down to the same thing, a matter of parental approval. So, basically, don't judge me for how I'm asking, just judge me for me if I'm going to be a good candidate to marry Naomi or not. And so hopefully that kind of answered the question. I saw that pop up right there. You can definitely use context, right? If the 1 line itself doesn't fully give you everything, read a little bit around it to help you out. But the more so just start with your focus on the lines they specify is going to be most beneficial strategically. No matter what, though, try to find that perfect puzzle piece. Try to have them work together accordingly. And just to kind of further explain it a different way right there. So the reason why none of the others work is because there is no textual evidence to prove it. So his only concern is, please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. Please don't judge me by the way I'm asking. And then he explains the reason he's not following tradition is because he doesn't have enough time and that he's got this matter of a potential job offer to decide on. And so that's why he's just coming straight to her instead of going through tradition, because the text says his only concern, or at least his only concern he voices, is the manner in which he's asking. That's why it has to be A on 4, that she will consider his proposal inappropriate, because that's the only thing he voices. He doesn't mention anything about sincerity or the imposition of the visit or even being immature. None of the others are mentioned. And going back to our number 1 rule, we can only take what the text gives us. So ultimately, we'll only have that 1 pair come through. Once again, I want to slow down right here, especially, and then we'll give all of you some time to work through some questions on your own right after this. But questions, concerns about this technique, as far as the working backwards, starting with the evidence first, utilizing the clues the test provides you to help you on these paired types of questions. And I'm sure, as we work through more problems, we'll definitely have more questions come up as far as specific situations are concerned. I'll go ahead and zoom things back in a little bit. We'll scroll around as needed for things. But then what we have left is that there still are a couple other questions that we're looking at. So 6 through 10 right here, we'll kind of have this be like the practice section like we had for the other slides. These ones I just like to have all have some continuity to them. So dealing with the same article and just sharing things accordingly. And so we'll kind of give, some time for each of these right here. Definitely be kind of looking through all of them. 6 is more of a big picture. 7 having us focus on a specific location. 8, we've got another vocab one to re-practice that technique. 9, 10, we've got another pair to re-practice that technique as well. So let's take some time right here. Look through these questions and answers on your own. And just like we do with the practice, kind of go ahead, put those answers back in the chat. We'll come back in a few minutes and work through those accordingly. Because I know with that pair, we're cutting off some of the lines. Squeeze everything as much as I can into the 2 pages, but also feel free to utilize your own copy as well. So take some time working through these practice problems 6 through 10 right here. And I know, probably a lot of you, still may be working on some of the questions, all good, right? Because, in order to truly do the timing, right, it's more of a treating it as a whole passage, which we will get into a little bit of that in our final 2 classes and give you the time to just work through the whole thing on your own. But for just, our exercise right here, We'll kind of start talking about some of these now accordingly. So zooming it back in right here, I'll guide us through what we're looking at. So the first one, question 6, in this passage, Akira addresses Chi with blank. And so I would characterize this much more as a big picture one, because this is looking at the accumulation of their interaction, not just necessarily saying like one specific thing or another. So we go through them. You definitely could go back to like certain conversations if need be, but much more general that we're looking at. So the first one, affection but not genuine love, anything dealing with like affection or love or anything like that, whether it's genuine or not, would be more appropriate for discussing Akira and Naomi, because those are the ones there to be wed, or like Chi and Naomi, the ones who are already family, mother-daughter right there. But with Akira and Chi, since those two don't really know each other beforehand, it would be hard to say anything definitive about this one. Tough to answer. B kind of tends to be a tempting choice when it's talked about objectivity, but not complete impartiality, because we know for sure that he's not being impartial, right? He definitely has an opinion as far as what should happen right here. So that part's true. The only issue with that is that if you're being objective about a situation, that means that you're only looking at the facts and you're not bringing personal opinion in. So you're either objective and you're impartial, or you're subjective, looking at your opinion and then not being impartial. So that one's actually contradictory. It can't be B. C, this would be if they were flipped. She treats Akira with amusement, but not mocking disparagement, doesn't really take him seriously. And that's flipped. If you misread the question, it's easy to pick that one. But then you go with D, respect, but not utter deference. This one checks out. Although he is breaking tradition, once they actually start talking, he is very respectful. He waits for permission to talk to her. But at the same time, willing to stand up for himself. When she initially doesn't take him seriously, he's not utterly deferent. He stands up for himself. He says why these are his intentions, why he still plans to marry Naomi. 7, I personally think this is the hardest one of the 10 in this first article right here. And one of the main reasons why this is the toughest is that all 4 answers have a kernel of truth in them. Because if we look at the first paragraph, and if it's not obvious, the paragraph numbers, they'll usually tell you what lines to look at, because this one is just the first one. It's just our first paragraph, the first 4 lines. It says, Akira came directly, breaking all tradition. Was that it? Had he followed form? Had he asked his mother to speak to his father to approach a go-between? Would she have been more receptive? And so they bring up the idea of a culture in a way, as far as saying, well, the tradition is to do this go-between when having a marriage proposal. But it's not just about that. It talks about the tradition in terms of other things, specifically at the end, leading to the point, would she have been more receptive? Had he followed form, would she have been more receptive? In the dashes, just like with writing, is the extra info. So it's okay, but we're also setting something else up. With B, criticizing a tradition, just because he doesn't follow it doesn't mean he thinks it's a bad tradition. He doesn't say it's bad, so criticizes out. C is tempting as well, because there are a lot of questions being asked. But in order to question a suggestion, that would mean something is suggested to you, and then you're responding with, wait, no, I don't want to do that. Why would I do it that way? That's not the exact situation right here. So although there are questions, it's not questioning a suggestion. Gets us to D, analyze a reaction. This is all building to that final point. Would she have been more receptive? That also links with the rest of the article. So when you have main purpose of a paragraph, either identify the primary thing, that could be a topic sentence, could be what it builds to in a final sentence, but also consider how does it relate to the rest of the article. This is setting up their interaction, analyze a reaction. Would she have been more receptive? The main purpose. The culture is relevant, but the only reason it's relevant is because she cares about it and it's affecting how she thinks about the situation. So D is our best one there. Now, 8, this returns us to the vocab right here as used in line 2. If you were just reading 7, you've just read this one, you might glance it over again for confirmation, but we have that word form. Akira came directly, breaking all tradition. Was that it? Had he followed blank? You might be repetitive and say tradition again. Was that it? Had he followed tradition? That's exactly the context. Which word matches tradition most closely? That's going to be custom. That's the one that's most synonymous with tradition, emphasizing our context right there. Then 9 and 10, this is another pair that we're going to see accordingly. So 9, why does Akira say his meeting with Chi is a matter of urgency? It does point to 32, where it says, Madam, forgive my disruption, but I come with a matter of urgency. So it says it's urgent. He establishes it in line 32. We need a reason for why is it urgent. And now you may already know it from just big picture if it stood out to you, but if not, go to your evidences. See which one lines up right there. So line 39. That one just says, I don't want to trouble you. They always do give the bookend word so you know where to start and finish right there. I don't want to trouble you. Well, that doesn't say why it's urgent. If he doesn't want to trouble her, well, why should he ask? It must not be urgent then. So that one doesn't work. We go to the next one. Normally, I would approach you more properly, but I've received word of a position. I have an opportunity to go to America as dentist for Seattle's Japanese community. This is checking all the boxes right here. If you feel confident about this one, you may decide to just pick it and move on because it says why it's a matter of urgency. He says he has an attractive job dentist in another country in America. Everything checks out right here. This is, fully lining up our pair. It fits perfectly. If you want to be sure, go ahead, check the other ones as well, because it is possible you might get a good versus better one, but this one seems pretty concrete. So if we do that, if we look at the other ones, the next one would be 5859. That one says, depending on your response, I may stay in Japan. I've come to ask for Naomi's hand. That also does point towards urgency, but it doesn't give us specific of a reason as 3942 does. If these were flipped, this would be a great example of a good versus better, where if you saw 5859 first, you're like, okay, that kind of makes sense, whether or not he's leaving the country. 3942, much more specific with the dentist, the attractive job. The last possible one, 7273. I see I've startled you. My humble apologies. I'll take no more of your evening. Kind of like how 39 was, really doesn't point to the urgency factor at all. So once you go through the other ones, that truly does confirm that C on 9, B on 10 is going to absolutely be our best pair right there. And I know, so there's a question going back to 7 right there. And I'll try to explain it kind of a little bit differently right here, because I agree, 7 is the toughest one that we're looking at. So with 7, if we go back to that one, main purpose of the first paragraph, I'll go back to what my strategy is for main purpose of a paragraph. The first way we could look at it is structurally, if we're building up to a certain point. So a final sentence, or if we start off with a topic sentence, if there is something definitive there, you can be with just that. But the other thing, and even if you have that topic sentence or that building conclusion, you want to make sure that your main purpose links to the rest of the passage, because you're never going to have just like an island where there's one paragraph that doesn't have any relation to the rest of things right there. And so with that in mind, we have to consider, what was the entire article about, right? So the entire article was about Akira seeking Chi's permission to marry Naomi. That was the primary event. If we go back to 1, 2, our big picture. So with D, analyze a reaction, not only is it backed up by the last line, would Chi have been more receptive? That is exactly analyzing a reaction, but it also links to our overall big picture right there. So whereas just saying describing a culture, although it says what is normal, that's very, very narrow right there. The only reason why it's relevant is to see what Chi's reaction was, because otherwise Akira doesn't care, Naomi doesn't care. Only Chi is the one who cares about the tradition. So A is definitely tricky. but D is our best one right there. Absolutely. Right. Questions there. All right. So then there's one other thing I'd like to just kind of show, and this will be like the last thing we talk about today on the reading side. In our next meeting, which is Sunday, there was the slight change in scheduling where the two final meetings are this Sunday and this Monday, same time. But on Sunday's class, we'll be going deeper into some of the articles, working through them a little bit more, seeing kind of the different types and maybe slightly different strategies we have, and giving you all opportunities to also work through them at your own pace. So we'll have that coming up on Sunday. But the one other thing I want to talk about today was we mentioned also how there's that skim technique that can be very, very effective on nonfiction. So we're just going to take a couple minutes right here and go ahead to the next article and see how I might skim it in something that's clearly going to be a nonfiction article. So we see that with our next one, questions 11 through 21 right here. One, when you see that there's a graph with something, you know it's going to be nonfiction in nature. Those only come with the nonfiction ones. Additionally, if you already have read a story, you know the others are not going to be stories, that they'll be nonfiction. We might look to our copyright information still to tell that this is not the historical one, 2008 copyright date. That's not going to be historical just from that. The other clue is that it is going to be a graph chart. You're never going to see those with the historical ones. So we know this is going to be nonfiction. We could treat this as an essay. And so I'll just kind of showcase how I would outline it to pull out information without having to read the entirety of it, something that can save you a lot of time. So start off with the introduction. Generally read this through or at least skim it. So the intro reads, every day millions of shoppers hit the stores in full force, both online and on foot, searching frantically for the perfect gift. Last year, Americans spent over $30 billion at retail stores in the month of December alone. Aside from purchasing holiday gifts, most people regularly buy presents for other occasions throughout the year, including weddings, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and baby showers. This frequent experience of gift giving can engender ambivalent feelings in gift givers. Many relish the opportunity to buy presents because gift giving offers a powerful means to build stronger bonds with one's closest peers. At the same time, many dread the thought of buying gifts. They worry that their purchases will disappoint rather than delight. So just from that introduction, we've got a pretty good view of things. We can feel very confident that this is about gift giving. That was brought up in the title as far as about gift price and feelings of appreciation, and it gets brought up a lot within the intro itself. So purchasing holiday gifts, regularly buy presents for other occasions. This frequent experience of gift giving can engender feelings. It talks about the good and the bad. Many relish the opportunity. At the same time, many dread the thought. So just from what we have so far, we know the general topic is gift giving. We know they're also going to be talking about the pros and the cons, exploring both sides. We don't have a firm opinion established just yet. Then once you get into your bodies, if you can start by just searching for a topic sentence, realistically locking in on the first 1 to 2 sentences of a paragraph and then moving ahead, that can be very, very effective so that you don't have to read all of it and get, consumed by the depth of the article. So our first paragraph says anthropologists describe gift giving as a positive social process serving various political, religious, and psychological functions. Economists, however, offer a less favorable view. So we see kind of a further explanation of just the pros and cons right there. We can expect those are going to be further looked at. Next body paragraph, line 35. What is surprising is that gift givers have considerable experience acting as both gift givers and gift recipients, but nevertheless tend to overspend each time they set out to purchase a meaningful gift. Okay, they had mentioned pros and cons earlier. This seems to be one of the negatives. I would expect further discussion about that idea of overspending. All right, line 51, next paragraph. Why do gift givers assume that gift price is closely linked to gift recipients' feelings of appreciation? Well, this is seeming to tie right back with my last paragraph. So that further confirms the last paragraph was about overspending. This is getting into why. What is the reason that they are overspending? And then we get to our final one. It could be a firm conclusion, might be kind of a hybrid body / conclusion. Says the notion of givers and receivers being unable to account for the other party's perspective seems puzzling because they slip in now these roles every day, and in some case multiple times in the course of the same day. Yet despite the extensive experience that people have as both givers and receivers, they often struggle to transfer information gained from one role to the other. And you kind of see it's continuing to go from there, but basically concluding that they're not on the same page. So although at first it talks just, hey, this is generally about gift giving, there's going to be pros and cons with it. We see as we go through the body paragraphs that it tends to focus much more on the negative sides of things, of the overspending, the not being able to get the right one, not being on the same page, and that's what the author is exploring right here. So just with that, this is an example how you might skim something using that outline technique. Really locking in at the beginning of a paragraph. Once you kind of have a firm idea, okay, this seems to be a legit topic for this paragraph, you can skip over the rest of it. With what we did right there, we realistically read about, like including the introduction, because I know that was the bulk of it right there. We read about 30 lines compared to 80 total. That cuts out half your reading with that outline technique. So definitely something to try if you haven't done it before. I recommend this, if you're short on time, this is a good thing to do. If you're uninterested in the article and you don't want to read it, this can be a good way so you don't have to read as much. Or thirdly, if you're finding the article difficult to read, generally taking a step back, reading less, focusing on the most important things, the big things with topic sentences, can get you out of the nitty-gritty, focus on the big picture. As we saw with the first article, and we'll see again as we do more practice, the questions will dictate to you which ones are the most important details, but getting this overall big picture at the beginning can definitely help us out. So we'll do plenty more exploring of this as far as practice articles are concerned, but just give us kind of a glimpse of also the nonfiction side. The one other thing I would note is that for the graphs, generally save the graphs for last. They'll have specific questions related to the graphs. Treat it like a detail. The questions will tell you what to look for there. So some people really like graphs. They just make the articles easier to understand. If you're one of those people, by all means, look at it. But for the most part, you don't have to worry about the graph until the specific questions that ask about it. All right, so like I said, plenty more to come. So we've got the 2 more classes. We've got Sunday's class, same time, Monday's class, also same time. And then that'll be wrapping up the course for us. As we wrap up, let's take the final 5 minutes or so, just address any general questions we have, to restate some of those reading strategies if you need clarification. If there's any other general questions we have as well, please ask those. But just any questions I can address at this moment. Yes, so Monday's class, that will be the final class, the last meeting for things. Yes, that is correct. Yes, so we will be going through things, and like I said, there's more to come, right? So this is not our final meeting, just like how the other classes, we had multiple math classes, multiple writing classes. We're going to be getting to the other articles as well. So we'll talk about the differences with history, the differences with the comparative ones, and as far as how to analyze that. We will be utilizing the same link. We'll be going over them together, giving you all some practice time to work through it. If you want to work ahead, by all means do so. But we'll be working through the remaining articles in this packet in the next 2 classes, along with the questions for this one right here. We'll actually jump right into this article and the questions next time, and then kind of go more a slower dive on the other articles to follow. So yeah, those will be coming. The history, the comparative, all that will be coming. Don't worry. Yeah, and then this one, Yeah, I addressed this question in last class. So there are a few colleges that when you submit your scores require you to submit every test you've ever taken. Georgetown's probably the most noteworthy of that. For most colleges in most situations, you're just going to be submitting your best score attempt or your best 2 attempts, your best ever math and your best ever verbal right there. So you have to clarify that if you weren't here yesterday. But always check with you where you're applying. Check the individual colleges policy on that as far as what they want to send. But typically, we're looking at your best overall score. Yes, yeah, and clarify once again. So 2 remaining classes, Sunday and Monday, the 21st, the 22nd. Those 2 will be the final meetings, Sunday and Monday. Right. Other questions I can address, and I'll write that. I'll write on the board. I'll stop the share of this one. Put it up on the whiteboard just so everyone can see right there. So the 2 final meetings for what we're looking at. So Sunday, still same time. Sunday, the 21st, same time. Monday, the 22nd, still same time. So those are going to be the 2 final meetings, those 2 dates. So that's on the board. Everyone can see right there. 2 final meetings. Right. Yeah, and so then, because I see there is kind of a clarification as far as the vocab questions are concerned. So do you mind just kind of clarifying your question a little bit? So besides just doing a full representation of the vocab techniques as far as looking for context first, understanding the meaning, and then picking similar meaning to that, was there kind of a specific thing about that vocab that you were concerned about? Okay, yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, and this is more, I would say, not just for vocab, but universal with the reading, the writing, the math, all of that right there. Is that for any question when we have the option to eliminate something, it's just something that we know is going to be false. So if you know something is false, and we've done this, writing, math, and we talked about this a little bit reading here, anytime you can prove something is wrong, that just gets you down to less and less choices. Ultimately, at the end of the day, for any section, reading, writing, math, if at the end you're still not sure and you're going to have to guess at the end, that's okay. It will happen. Can guarantee it will happen to everyone at some point. We would just much rather guess on 2 finalists where we've eliminated 2 that we know are false, as opposed to having to guess between all 4. And even in the elimination process, you look at all 4 answers, none of them seem right, but you can definitively prove that 3 answers are wrong. Well, then that means we're only left with 1, and that choice must be correct if we know for sure the others are false. So that's more the idea of eliminating answer choices, not exclusive to vocab, not exclusive to reading, just an overall good test strategy right there. All right. Excellent. Then I think we'll probably wrap up with things right there then. Have a good couple days, everyone. I'll see you same time on Sunday, where we'll continue working through the reading side of the test.